Yo, what is going on, Company Gang? It's your boy Company here. And for today's video, what I wanted to discuss is basically this idea that being an adult is incredibly overrated and the many reasons why I don't wish to grow up and that I wish to have a permanent case of Peter Pan syndrome. So, anyways, I think the biggest thing, first of all, would probably have to be adult responsibilities, specifically the fact that I want to avoid them. And in my opinion, I think as children, we're often sold this idea that, growing up and quote unquote, adulting, having to do all these different tasks like driving to and from work, commuting, maybe on the subway, if driving is not an option, or yeah, and then just driving everywhere in general, paying your taxes, setting appointments, filing for permits and licenses, and having to groom yourself and clean and cook and do all these different things, and the list just goes on and on. Is actually a quote unquote fun thing, but in reality, in my opinion, this is just a massive lie we tell children in order to prevent them from roping before the age of 18. Because if they were to grow up and become adults, they would realize that a lot of these tasks that they're expected to do are, first of all, very tedious, they're very boring, and very repetitive. I mean, there's only so much you can do, for example, cleaning and cooking and trying to improve that. And obviously, you can kind of like turn it into a game where like you try and like find the most efficient way to clean your house and do this and that, or like, become like an expert at shaving your own beard somehow. But I mean, there's only so much you could do as far as that goes, unless you're trying to become like a professional. And it takes like a very certain type of person to even like find that sort of motivation. And for the vast majority of people, they aren't going to find many of these activities intrinsically motivating in the first place. And as a consequence, it's just going to be, a massive emotional burden, having to do all these things over and over again every day, just in order to be able to fit in. I think a good analogy would be, like Sisyphus, pushing the rock up the hill only for it to roll down again, and then having to do it over and over again. And I think that's a fate a lot of adults are doomed to in terms of their responsibilities, because they're essentially kicking the can down the road over and over again. You're always going to have to pay your taxes next year. You're always going to have to shave your beard. You're always going to have to do this and that. It's almost as if like you are basically putting a lot of your time and energy into something that will have no foreseeable benefit in the long run. I'm not talking about things like exercise or like, because that can have benefits in the long run, but I'm talking about the really, really tedious shit that just doesn't lead to anything, but you have to do anyway just to like maintain your status as a quote unquote functioning adult. And not only are a lot of these like activities very tedious, but a lot of them are oftentimes very redundant, because they're either born out of a lot of antiquated notions of how people should be and in society, and as a result, a lot of these ideas end up affecting laws and regulations and things of that nature. Or there's just a lot of inefficiency in the system, whereby things like taxes, for example, could be instituted in a way where it would just be so much more efficient, so much more simple, and still have pretty much the same positive benefits or outcomes from that, if you believe in that kind of thing. I'm not here to make like a political argument about taxes or not, but I'm just like, I think regardless of whether taxes actually benefit society, like you as a person or not, I think the way they are collected could be so much easier, so much better expedited, so much more efficient. But instead, we have to fill out pages and pages of forms and do the math perfectly and all that shit, and people end up having to pay accountants for that. So in a sense, yeah, like as a result, a lot of these things are either unnecessary or could be done in a way which is way easier, where you're exerting like 10% of the effort just to undertake these adult responsibilities. So yeah, that's one huge thing, is like avoiding that. And the reasons why being a NEET is great is that, yeah, I get to ignore that shit and just do whatever the fuck I want. So the next thing, which directly ties to this, is this idea of having control of your time. And in my opinion, as an adult, you have way less control of your time than, let's say, a child does. Because I think it's a pretty common misconception that when you're a child, you have to go to school, you have to do this, you have to do that, and you're basically forced to do whatever you like by your parents, and you have no freedom and stuff like that. But while this is true in many cases, in my opinion, being a child, a lot of the responsibilities placed on you on a child are uh, are basically like watered down versions of what you would have to do as an adult. So the positive of this is that it's way easier a lot of the time. So let's say school, instead of 8 hours a day, is only 6 to 7 hours a day, whereas working jobs is often like 8 to 10 hours a day, depending on where you live. And then, so that's just one example. Homework, you have homework as a kid, but then everything else is taken care of. You don't have to do shit. So, as a result, you, you, yeah, you save a lot of time that way. So as a kid, you're probably looking at like maybe 3 to 4 hours of free time on weekdays, and then maybe like 2 full weekends off, unless you go to some like Ivy League prep school or something, then that's a completely different story. But for most people, it's definitely like a way more relaxed time in their lives. I even went to like a fairly like preppy school, but I feel like, I had, well, I guess I have no basis of comparison given that I've never had like a proper job, but I imagine it's way easier. It didn't feel that hard to me. Like I slacked off a lot and was still able to get a lot of shit done and do decent. Whereas as an adult, you have, let's say, if you were to take into account all the different responsibilities which I mentioned earlier, you have, let's say, grooming yourself, cleaning, cooking, preparing different things, filling out forms, taxes, getting ready for work. Some workplaces force you to work at home like extra, and us all this stuff. Then you're probably looking at like, and then when you take into account like small talk and all these different things that you have to do to fit into society, you're probably looking at like 4 to 5 hours burned on that. And then when you take into account your job, which is like 8 to 9 hours, sometimes even 10, and then you're looking at like maybe 1 to 2 hours of free time on average if you sleep 6 to 7 hours a day. And obviously you can make the argument that yeah, you can stay up later, but then you're sacrificing your sleep, which just makes life infinitely worse and makes your job infinitely more like stressful. So in my opinion, that trade-off doesn't really count as an option, because the amount of suffering essentially remains equal. So instead, yeah, like you're forced to do a lot of things that burn a lot of time as an adult, and as a result, you can't really enjoy a lot of things properly in like 1 to 2 hours, because like first of all, like when let's say you're in like the flow of like watching a series or playing the video game, having to cut that off in order to go to bed on time, it just completely ruins it. And not only that, but there's only so much you can consume anyway within that period of time. And not only that, if you're like one of those unlucky adults that has to work on Saturdays too, or on Sunday, then you only have one day off. Then and then most of the day is spent preparing yourself for the next week, or doing things that you couldn't otherwise do during like the weekday. Then you're really looking at very, very little time to basically enjoy yourself and express yourself authentically. And I think that's one of the main reasons why people are so miserable, is because how a person spends their free time or their time in general is often a very important form of self-expression. And if that is being inhibited by the amount of shitty responsibilities that you have to undertake as an adult, then you're really left with nothing. And as a result, you almost feel like you're basically in a mental prison of sorts. And also relating to this is this idea of adult hobbies, because let's say in your free time, you're supposed to, do whatever you want and enjoy whatever you want, and that's your free time. But what a lot of people don't talk about is the fact that oftentimes we are expected to engage in a set amount of a very limited amount of socially sanctioned activities and hobbies, like for example, drinking, uh, gambling, gaming. I'm not gaming. Well, I guess gaming is more accepted now, but it's still kind of frowned upon as being childish. But then, things like your hobbies and your interests are very controlled by society. And in order to fit in, you're almost expected to, have a set amount of knowledge about certain like topics. And, you're not like rewarded, or you're only rewarded for engaging in like activities and behaviors which are like not esoteric, which are very like standard and cookie cutter, like being interested in like motor vehicles, for example. And what's interesting is that I find that a lot of quote unquote normal functioning adults, they'll always talk about the exact same shit. Like for example, they always talk about their car, or like and like for example, they'll talk about their I don't know, like their fucking this the material their seats are made out of. Like instead of like fucking synthetic leather, they have like, I don't know, their Lexus has genuine leather, uh I don't know, fucking beige seating and some shit. And then they talk about their wheels and their suspension and their engine and all this stuff. But you can really tell that they're only like talking about it on like a surface level. Like they basically like Googled a bunch of shit about their car, and basically you know basically use that as a means of like bragging about their car, essentially, when in reality they really know jack shit about automobiles. But it's just like everybody is expected to have like a very surface, so it's not like they're like car enthusiasts, because if they were, I could understand that. But a lot of them are really just like doing it in order to fit in, and like basically like engage in some massive like dick measuring contest. And the same can be said of like things like like drinking, for example. Like people will talk about alcohol and the different, like, I don't know, vintage and stuff, but it's like very few people actually know what they're talking about, but they're just doing it in order to A, and to fit in, and B, maybe like it's just another measure of status. Because if you know more about expensive wines, then it shows that you're more cultured and all that. And it's like, yeah, and obviously you can just do whatever the fuck you want, but if you do that and you're like being a quote unquote adult, you get punished heavily for it, where you probably will get, especially if you're not like, obviously if you're like a ultra attractive dude, you can get away, or like woman, you can get away with whatever you want. But if you're like a normal looking dude and below, then you're kind of forced to like conform, because if you don't, then you're punished socially for it, and then you miss out on a lot of opportunities. People will probably avoid talking to you. This doesn't happen all the time, but it happens frequently enough where a lot of people will end up living their lives inauthentically. And this ties back to time being wasted, because as I mentioned before, like your free time is supposed to be your time, but a lot of times people will convince themselves that they like certain socially acceptable things, like activities, different TV shows, in order to fit in with the Joneses. And they'll research stuff just so that they can fit in, and convince themselves that they actually, and convince other people that they're part of society, and and themselves that they actually like what they're doing. When in reality, if they were left to their own devices, they would probably never come within like, I don't know, like walking distance of a lot of these different activities, so to speak. Like but they just do it anyway, because I don't know, so it just ends up being like a massive waste of time and soul sucking, and like just causes a lot of emptiness in people, because they have to like engage in these activities and display interest in these hobbies, which they're not intrinsically motivated to pursue in the first place. And the great thing about my situation is like I get to basically engage in the things that I'm genuinely interested in. Like a lot of the time, like before, I definitely tried to avoid this part of myself that enjoyed anime, that enjoyed like nerdy shit, I guess. But being left to my own device, it just made me realize how like genuinely interested I am in a lot of these things, which people will look down upon as being childish. And not only that, but another thing which I forgot to touch upon, as far as like as time being wasted, is that given that I'm a NEET, it's like even better than being an actual child, because I don't have any like of like the responsibility of like going to school and doing homework. So it's almost as if like I'm a child being left to his own devices, basically getting to live as free as I want. So anyways, yeah, that's another thing. Another reason why I don't want to become an adult is that the fact that the world is a scary place. Obviously, they always tell you that the world is basically your oyster and that, the world is like great once you grow up, but they never warn you about the dangers of growing up. For example, uh, if you fuck up paying your taxes, then you're going to be confronted by the IRS or the CRA and, get fined out the ass, like thousands of dollars, and, potentially even go to jail if you somehow fuck that up even more. Then there's things like driving, where you're essentially putting yourself in a tin can and accelerating it, hundreds of miles, like tens of kilometers per hour. Where if you ever crashed, then you would probably get fucked up and suffer some either life-ending like injury, or just have to deal with injuries anyway, which is probably just as bad as dying, honestly, like in my opinion. But yeah, just there's that, and there's things like, I don't know, just all these things like there's people, the risk of dealing with people, because you never know, like if you piss off the wrong person at work, and then it turns out they have connections, or they're just very vindictive and sensitive, they could fuck up your life. There's so many risks that you expose yourself to as an adult that you get to avoid as a child, or when you live like a child, which is I think one of the main appeals of being a NEET. So yeah, I think in a lot of ways you actually are safer, and if you ever choose to you know engage in certain risks, I feel like you have a lot more control over what risk you're exposed to as a man child, as dumb as that sounds, than like an actual adult. So yeah, I think the world the world is definitely pretty risky. And I think the last thing was probably have to be like have to deal with people, which kind of I touched on a bit earlier. But yeah, like for example, as an adult, you're expected to engage in and maintain all these relationships, which in reality a lot of them are like very redundant and superfluous, just like the hobbies and activities which I talked about earlier. Because a lot of times I think people are sort of like forced to make buddy with everybody, firstly because that's what you're expected to do, but secondly, in your workplace, for example, you're forced to maintain good relations with other people in order to maintain social cohesion in the workforce and be a quote unquote team player, because if you don't, then you're punished for that. So as a result, you're forced to talk about things which you have no interest in, which ties into the whole idea of engaging normie hobbies. It's all has to do with this idea of fitting in with people and maintaining proper relationships. You have to maintain a lot of relationships with like your bosses, your coworkers, the people who you see frequently, the doctor, whatever. Yeah, you're basically expected to make buddy, and in my opinion, that can be just as exhausting, because a lot of times you're forced to either if you can't trick yourself into like fitting in or liking the things that they like, or that is commonly accepted by society, then you're basically forced to just like play along, or like hide parts of yourself. And a lot of times that can be very demoralizing, because you're essentially forced to live inauthentically just to fit in. And I think that can be a huge burden in the long run. And not only that, but just have to maintain the amount of relationships that a typical normally has to maintain. It almost like cuts into their time even more. And I'm not saying like maintaining relationships is a bad thing inherently. In fact, I think it's a very important thing. But in my opinion, I think the average person was, evolutionarily speaking, like grew up in a very small village context. So they only knew like a handful of people and got to know them really well and got to learn to deal with them. But the average person nowadays probably has a network in the maybe at least of like 50 people, if not branching out into like the hundreds. And then there's social media, which only expands that further. So it's like the quality of the social relationships decrease, and it's like the actual good relationships that you might have like spent time cultivating are sort of like put in the back burner, because you have to deal with so many people at the same time. And obviously there are people out there who can manage their time properly, who can manage their responsibilities, their social relationships properly, and all these sorts of things, learn to not waste their time and make the most of their work situation. find a way to do that safely. But for the vast majority of people, um, it's like yeah, it's just an impossibility because of just how complex the world has become. And as a result, you get statistics like 90% of people finding their jobs unsatisfying, 90 just the rates of depression, unhappiness in society, and even the people who claim to be happy, who put on a brave face in social media, a lot of the times they're deeply unhappy. And trust me when I say that, I have witnessed multiple times in my life people who I thought were just living their best life, but it turns out there was just a huge amount of emptiness and insecurity and all this sort of shit, behind that. People who I would have once looked up to as being responsible adults and living, happy lives. It turns out there's just all this shit in the back burner. And, in fact, all being an adult really was just distracting themselves from themselves and from their inner thoughts and from the problems and their relationships and their lives, which they desperately want to bury underneath like basically like a pile of work, basically. So and like responsibilities. So yeah, I think being an adult is inherently just not as base as being like a base man child neat rot maxing infantile fucking degenerate. So I can't believe these are the actual words escaping my mouth. And I might be a bit hyperbolic, but yeah, I do genuinely believe that if you manage your time correctly as a NEET, in a lot of ways, it can be a lot more fulfilling than being an adult. And as I've mentioned in previous videos and have explained in detail before, a lot of the milestones and rewards that you get from living as an adult are oftentimes like overstated, or you never even received in the first place, and like only a very small select portion of the population actually benefits from living as an adult, whereas most people are forced to basically live as indentured servants or slaves for the rest of their life. And speaking of dangers of the world being a scary place, I forgot to mention that there's also things like people tempting you with credit cards and shit like that, people putting poison in your food, things that you would never have to worry about. And that kind of reminds me, like, another great thing about being a child is that everything is so carefree. You don't have to worry about politics. A lot of the things that you are sort of like forced to confront as an adult, you basically get to shut out as a child and instead lose yourself in your worlds like of imagination. Being a child is great because you get to basically escape and do whatever you want, or live your ideal life, live authentically, and express yourself the way you want to. Whereas being an adult just involves, it's the complete opposite, which just involves conforming. Even in like individualistic societies nowadays, you're basically living like it's fucking 1990s to 2000 Japan, just like salaryman culture. It's not as bad in the West as in Asia, but it's just not much better. So I'm kind of rambling at this point. My point in making this video is that, yeah, being an adult fucking sucks. And those are just some of the many reasons why I think being an adult is overrated and why I want to remain a fucking man-child for the rest of my life as much as I can help it. And sorry, one more thing is that obviously I'm not shaming you if you have to do a lot of these responsibilities just to survive, because you got to do what you got to do. But if you can avoid it, like in my case, for example, or if your situation allows it, then I say, why not? Just don't let anybody shame you for doing that if you decide to take that option. So anyways, yeah, this is Company signing out, and peace.